Thank you, Your Honor. The state calls David Pleoger.
Maybe you just stand here for a second. Raise your right hand. Swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth.
I do.
And before you begin, if you could remove your mask, that would help us hear better. And second, if you could give us your full name, spelling each of your names.
David, D-A-V-I-D, last name Pleoger, P-L-E-O-G-E-R.
Mr. Slisher.
Thank you very much, Your Honor.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Can you please tell the jury where you used to work?
City of Minneapolis Police Department,
How long were you a Minneapolis Police Department officer?
approximately 27 years.
You recently retired.
I did.
And when did you begin your career as a Minneapolis police officer?
1993.
And where did you start? Did you start your law enforcement career at MPD?
No, previously I worked at the Richmond, Minnesota Police Department for approximately 6 months.
Okay. And after working at Richmond, you moved to the Minneapolis Police Department, is that right?
Correct.
And did you do your academy training through Minneapolis Police Department?
I did.
And you received your post license through Minneapolis, is that right?
Yes.
And you are a sworn law enforcement officer.
Yes.
And what does that mean to be a sworn law enforcement officer?
I'm licensed in the state of Minnesota through the Police Officer Standard and Training Board.
And do you take a specific oath to be a sworn officer?
Yes.
And can you tell us a little bit about your career with the Minneapolis Police Department? Did you start out, I'm assuming, in patrol?
Yes, I started in patrol.
And how long did you work as a patrol officer?
Till approximately 2001 when I was promoted to sergeant.
And what shift did you start as a patrol officer?
Dog watch.
What's dog watch for those who don't know?
Overnights.
Okay. Starting typically,
Approximately 9 at night to 7 in the morning.
okay. And as a patrol officer with the Minneapolis Police Department, what were your typical duties?
Traffic law enforcement, responding to 911 calls, things of that nature.
Okay. What kind of 911 calls would you typically respond to?
Domestics, accidents, anything people call us for.
General law enforcement, reactive sometimes, is that right?
Correct.
And proactive being on patrol.
Right.
After 5 years on patrol, did you take a different assignment?
Yes, I was on the community response team for a while.
Now, what is the community response team?
I was more of a proactive team dealing with things like narcotics, prostitution, narcotic search warrants.
And did that team, I guess, patrol or have jurisdiction over the entire city, or was it within a particular precinct?
That was in the 5th precinct.
And you said you were with the CRT for a few years. What did you do after that?
Then I was promoted in 2001 and worked in the forgery and fraud unit for a short time.
And what rank were you promoted to?
Sergeant.
And is that the rank that you retired as?
Yes, sir.
Approximately what year then were you promoted to sergeant, if you can remember?
2001.
And what was your most recent assignment as a Minneapolis Police Department sergeant?
I was a sergeant in the 3rd precinct on, it's called mid-watch.
What's the mid-watch shift?
That was 3 o'clock in the afternoon until 1 in the morning.
At this time, I'd like to publish Exhibit 268. All right, I don't know how well that can be seen on the screen, but Exhibit 268 is a precinct map, is that correct?
Yes.
The 3rd precinct of Minneapolis, and you see that there's some additional numbers as well. If you could shrink that down a little bit. Can you describe what you see here on the 3rd precinct map? You see the number 310 and underneath it 320.
Right, those are some districts within the precinct.
So the precinct is divided into districts and then from there divided into particular sectors. Is that right?
Correct.
And as the mid-watch shift sergeant, what were your responsibilities?
I supervise that entire precinct and the officers under me on the mid-watch shift.
As a supervisory police officer, what are your responsibilities with respect to the other officers and their duties?
Take a look at the reports. Keep an eye on their activities, make sure they're staying busy, things of that nature.
Do you have to assign officers to ride together?
Yes, I do.
Do you have to brief officers at the beginning of a shift?
That's correct. I do a roll call briefing every afternoon before they started.
Just please describe for the jury what a roll call briefing is.
I take any things from the department, new policies, procedures, pass around posters of people who are wanted for crimes. Just let them know what was going to be going on for the night.
How long does roll call usually take?
Probably 15 minutes.
And this is done at the beginning of the shift?
Yes.
Approximately how many officers then would attend a roll call typically?
10 to 14.
And so you said that you'd be distributing policies and procedures. I'm assuming then you'd have to be familiar with those policies and procedures yourself. Is that right?
Correct.
And so you're familiar with the Minneapolis Police Department Policy and Procedure Manual?
Yes.
And as it gets updated, you push those updates out to other officers whom you supervise. Is that right?
Correct.
Do you also occasionally review and approve reports of officers you supervise?
I do.
And do you also review their conduct, as in reviewing uses of force?
Yes.
What do you call it when a sergeant reviews a police officer's use of force?
Force review report.
Could you please describe the process of a force review?
Typically, an officer would call me, or I'd be notified by radio that they'd use force on a suspect or arrested party. I would head out, interview the officer, interview the subject that the force was used on, take a statement from both of them, and then complete a report on that, which would eventually be routed down to the internal affairs unit.
And are there certain circumstances where an officer uses force which they're required to notify you?
Yes.
Can you tell us just your recollection what those circumstances are?
Certain scenarios, force on a handcuff, any type of force on a handcuffed prisoner would result in me doing that. Strikes, any injury or claimed injury by a arrested party.
And so when an officer uses force, a patrol officer, and you're their supervisor, there are circumstances that they have to report it to you, and there's circumstances where they just don't. Is that right?
That's correct.
And there's some circumstances where they have to write a report, and some in which they do not. True?
Right.
So are you familiar with use of force reporting requirements 5-306? That policy generally?
You'd have to read the headline of it for me to get it.
Well, I'm going to show you then what's been marked for identification as Exhibit 221. 5-306, you read the title there.
Code of Use of Force Reporting and Post-Instant Requirements.
And you see the, have I introduced this? Oh, I'm sorry, Your Honor. At this time, the state offers Exhibit 221.
Let's go on sidebar a second.
Members of the jury, the parties, yesterday when I said they were going to help us streamline things, it revolves around the Minneapolis police policies that were in effect on May 25th, 2020. They are going to be received by you as exhibits 206 through 234. What the stipulation means, or in other words, an agreement between the parties that they do not have to provide witnesses, will actually provide the foundation and the proof that these are the exact policies and that they were in effect on May 25th, 2020. They're simply saying that you may accept these policies as being the policies in place on May 25th, 2020, without any further testimony or evidence. And so on that basis, the state is offering 206 through 234, is that correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
206 through 234 are received pursuant to stipulation.
And also I'll offer Exhibit 268, Your Honor.
268, any objection to 268?
Oh, no.
268 is received.
All right, then, sir, referring you back to Exhibit 221, if you see 5-306, that's the use of force reporting and post-incident requirements, is that right?
Yes.
You see this term cappers, no cappers report required. What's a cappers report?
That was our old, the name for our old report writing system.
And now that's referred to as a PIMS report.
Yes,
We just call it a police report.
sure.
Okay, so there's certain circumstances where no police report is required for a use of force unless an injury or an alleged injury has occurred. Is that right?
Yes.
All right, and then if you could, would you clear that, Your Honor? Please proceed to the next page of 221. You highlight the top portion, please. And so the different uses of force that do not require a police report, could you just read the list there?
Escort holds, joint manipulations, nerve pressure points, handcuffing, and gun drawing or pointing.
All right. Now, there are also circumstances in which a police report is required, but they don't need to notify you as a supervisor. Is that right?
Yes.
And what are those circumstances?
Takedowns and chemical agent,
What is a takedown?
like putting somebody on the ground.
And then if you could move up the page, there's certain circumstances in which both a report is required and supervisory notification is required. Is that right?
Yes.
And what are those circumstances?
Where they sustained an injury or had to render medical aid.
Now, when you as a supervisor are notified by a patrol officer that they've used force because of an alleged injury, what do you do?
I usually head out to the scene to interview both the officers and the parties that the force was used on.
And you've already explained that, but you also have to write a force report, is that right?
That's correct.
And when is that force report required to be completed?
Before the end of the shift.
If we could go back to the first page of that Exhibit 221. Also like to draw your attention to the first paragraph under medical assistance. If you could please highlight that portion. Under medical assistance, could you please read the provision that's called out here?
As soon as reasonably practical, determine if anyone was injured and render medical aid consistent with training and request EMS if necessary.
So the requirement under policy is both to call the ambulance and to render emergency aid while you're waiting for the ambulance. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, I'd like to talk to you about another policy, and if I could pull up Exhibit 225. You familiar with Minneapolis Police Department policy governing the use of the maximal restraint technique, or Hobble?
Yes.
Just at a very high level, can you explain what a Hobble is?
Basically, device used to take control of someone's hands and feet at the same time to prevent them from kicking or acting out aggressively.
Is this a situation in which the subject would already be handcuffed?
Yes.
Okay. And so the hands would be restrained. How would the feet be restrained?
They'd be like hooked together with the hobble, and then the end of the hobble oftentimes ran through the belt or somewhere by the waist to prevent them from kicking.
And that was my next question. That would be the purpose, is to prevent the kicking of a restrained subject. Is that right?
Yes.
And the hobble or maximal restraint technique also requires supervisory reporting. Is that right?
It does.
If you would highlight section Roman 4:3. And you can see here by policy that a supervisor shall be called to the scene where a subject has been restrained using the MRT or hobble. Is that right?
Yes.
And then as a supervisor, you would have to go and evaluate whether the hobble was properly and necessarily used. Is that right?
Yes.
And then if you could highlight section B on that same page. After a hobble is used on an individual, and typically when a hobble is used, it means that the person has been placed in a prone position. Is that right?
That's correct.
At least initially, to get the hobble on.
Yes.
Can you explain to the jury what the prone position is?
Basically flat on your stomach on the ground.
Okay. Once a hobble is used to restrain the hands and the feet and the subject is in the prone position, what does the policy require an officer to do?
Put them in the side recovery position.
What is the side recovery position?
Basically roll them up on their side to ease their breathing rather than leave them laying on their stomach or chest.
And do you know why that's important?
It helps them breathe better. Rather than having all the weight on their chest, it gets them up on their side so they can breathe easier.
Are you familiar with the term positional asphyxia?
Yes.
Now, how are you familiar with that term?
We've had it in training at MPD.
How long have you personally been aware of positional asphyxia?
A lot of years, 10, 15.
And based on your experience as a Minneapolis police officer, are the dangers of positional asphyxia generally known throughout the department?
Yes, I believe so.
That's something that officers are trained on?
Correct.
And when we talk about positional asphyxia, just at a high level, could you explain what positional asphyxia is, as you've been trained?
If you restrain somebody or leave them on their chest and stomach for too long, their breathing can become compromised, and so you'd want to get them up out of that position after a while so they don't suffer breathing complications.
And that's why the policy requires in the training is that you roll someone onto the side recovery position.
Yes.
And are you aware of whether or not people are allowed to be transported in the prone position, restrained?
I believe they should be transported in the recovery position.
And when you talk about the need to roll someone into the recovery position to alleviate breathing, you're just talking about a situation where the pressure is from the subject's own body weight. Is that right?
That could be, yes.
That does not necessarily include additional pressure that might be applied.
Correct.
So the danger is there without anyone pressing down on them.
Yes.
You could take that down, please. Were you working as a sergeant supervisor in the 3rd Precinct on in May of 2020?
Yes.
And at that time, what were your duties as a patrol sergeant?
As I explained before, report approval, monitor the shift for the night, roll call, any use of force reporting.
And again, you were working the mid-watch shift, is that right?
Yes.
And May 25, 2020, were you also working as a shift sergeant?
I was.
Oh, I'm going to ask you if you're familiar with an individual named Derek Chauvin.
I am.
Chauvin, I apologize. Derek Chauvin. How are you familiar with this person?
He was an officer on my shift,
How long have you known him?
probably since around 2008.
So he was already working as an officer when you were hired?
I don't think he was when I was hired, but
Okay.
eventually he was on my shift, yes.
He was on your shift.
Correct.
And do you recognize Mr. Chauvin in the courtroom today?
I do,
Would you please point to him?
right there.
May the record reflect that the witness has identified the defendant.
Any objection? And will.
Could you please just describe your relationship with Mr. Chauvin?
He was an officer on middle watch with me, I'm gonna say approximately 2008. So he'd been there a number of years, so I was supervised there.
It was strictly a working relationship?
Correct.
You ever socialized with him outside of a work setting?
No,
Are you familiar with an individual named Tu Tao?
I am.
How do you know Mr. Tao?
He was also an officer on my mid-watch shift.
Approximately how long did you know him?
Probably approximately 5 years.
Do you have a similar relationship with Mr. Tao as you do the defendant?
Yes,
And then I need to ask you about Thomas Lane and Alexander King. You recognize those names?
I do. They were new officers on my shift.
Were you on duty around 8:30 p.m. on May 25, 2020?
Yes.
And what were you doing at that time?
I think I just headed back into the office after doing some patrol in the street.
And when you do patrol work, do you use a body camera?
I do.
And that's something that's required of all officers, including supervisors, is that right?
Correct.
You have different means of communicating with the police officers you supervise and dispatch when you're out on patrol.
Yes.
What do you use?
Radio and cell phone.
Do you recall approximately 8:30 p.m. receiving a telephone call from a dispatcher?
I do.
What was the dispatcher's name?
I believe it was Jenna Scurry.
Can you please describe for the jury what Ms. Scurry said to you in this telephone call?
She called to say she didn't mean to be a snitch, but she'd seen something, viewing a camera that she thought was concerning and was calling to let me know about it.
Okay. At this time, I'm going to ask to publish Exhibit 10. I apologize, Exhibit 12.
2:30:14, May 25, 2020.
Hey, this is Jenna with Channel 1. Hey, what's up? Hey, so, just wanted to let you know about the person with a knife at 2602 Bloomington. And then, I didn't know, you can call me a snitch if you want to, but we have the cameras up for 320's call. Oh, did they already put him in the, they must have already started moving him. And 320 over at Cup Foods.
Okay.
I don't know if they had used force or not. They got something out of the back of the squad, and all of them sat on this man. So I don't know if they needed you or not, but they haven't said anything to me yet.
Yeah, they haven't said anything unless it's just a takedown, which doesn't count, but
Okay,
I'll find out.
no problem. We don't get to ever see it, so when we see it, we're just like, well, that looks
Okay.
a little different. All right, thank
All
you.
right.
Bye.
Sounds good. Bye.
20:31:33, May 25, 2020.
Sir, did you recognize your own voice in that telephone call?
Yes, that was me.
You made a reference to possibly it not counting. Can you please explain to the jury what that means?
I thought maybe she was just describing that they'd taken somebody to the ground, placed them on the ground, and that wasn't something that would trigger me to head out for use of force, but said she wasn't sure, then I had to make a call to find out.
So per the policy, if it was just a takedown, that would not necessarily be reportable to a supervisor. Is that
That's
right?
correct.
Had you ever received a call like this from a dispatcher before?
Not in those exact terms, but a few other times dispatchers have called me if they saw something that concerned them.
Okay. And so based on that call, did you decide to make some further inquiry?
I did.
What did you do?
I called Officer Chauvin on his cell phone.
At this time, I'd asked to publish Exhibit 75.
Hello, 2:30 here. Yeah, I was just gonna call you and have you come out to our scene here. Not really, but we just had to hold the guy down. He was going crazy. Wouldn't go in, shutting off for the moment. Wouldn't go in the back of the squad.
All right.
Council on 75.
Yes, Your
All
Honor.
right, thank you.
Now, sir, you recognize the voice in that call?
Yes,
Whose voice was that?
Officer Chauvin.
That was the conversation, or at least his end of the conversation, as you recall it on that day that you just described.
Yes.
He made a reference to shutting off. Can you explain to the jury what that was in reference to?
I probably asked him if he had his camera on or off, since we're having a private conversation.
And that would be within policy, within the body-worn camera policy, for him to shut off during that conversation. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. Can you describe then, as best you can recall, the conversation that you had with the defendant after the audio cut?
Could you ask the question again?
Yes, Your Honor. Can you please describe the conversation you had with the defendant? What statements did the defendant make to you during the rest of that call?
Overruled.
I believe he told me that they'd had tried to put Mr. Floyd, I didn't know his name at the time, but Mr. Floyd in the car. He'd become combative. I think he mentioned that he'd injured, it was either his nose or his mouth, a bloody lip, I think. And eventually, after struggling with him, he'd suffered a medical emergency and an ambulance was called. And then I decided I'd head down to the scene.
Is that the extent of what you can remember the defendant telling you about this incident?
I think that was basically it.
Did he tell you whether he personally applied any particular type of force or restraint to Mr. Floyd?
I don't believe so.
Did he tell you whether or not he had to, or other officers, pin Mr. Floyd to the ground?
I think in the conversation there he said something about held somebody down.
Did he mention anything about putting his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck or back?
No.
And is the placement of a knee on a subject's neck a use of force?
Yes.
A reportable type of force?
Not necessarily.
And why is that?
If we're handcuffing somebody in a prone position or fighting with someone, it could happen where your knee ends up on their neck.
Okay. For about how long?
I guess whatever's reasonable.
Okay. And which would be when?
Until you get control of the party, I guess.
Control is in the person is then handcuffed?
Handcuffed and not continuing to fight with you anymore.
So once the subject is handcuffed and no longer resisting,
Yes.
at that point, the restraint should stop.
Yeah.
All right, after you spoke with the defendant, what did you do?
I headed down to the 38th in Chicago where he was at.
This time I asked to publish Exhibit 1. 38th in Chicago is within the 3rd precinct, is that correct?
Yes.
And you recognize Exhibit 1.
I do.
And you see the area of Cup Foods, the Dragon Walk, and the Speedway. Is that right?
Correct.
Can you please describe what you saw when you arrived at the scene?
I think I pulled up in the officers were standing near their squad car, and there might have been an EMS vehicle still on scene and a few people milling around.
Did you recognize the officers?
I did.
Did you speak to anybody prior to your arrival?
I think Officer Chauvin called me just as I was arriving, but it only lasted a second because I was like a half a block out. It said I'll be right there.
At this time, I'd ask to publish Exhibit 267. Sure, I'm showing you a photo taken from your own body-worn camera, and can you see the timestamp there?
20:45 and 26 seconds.
All right. And you can see the name. Is this your cell phone?
Yes.
And it's, you see that you're receiving a call from the defendant. Is that right?
Yeah, it looks like maybe I'm about to hang up.
Okay. Yes, can you please just describe this conversation as best you can recall?
I think he just called and said, asked where I was at maybe, and how long I was out, and I was real close. So I said I'll be right there. We'll talk in person, and hung up.
Okay. And you could see from, if you could put 267 up again, please. You recognize the building that you were near, right?
Not offhand.
All right. If you could pull up Exhibit 1. All right. If you take a look, can you recall exactly where you were when you pulled up as you were receiving that call?
Where I ended up parking.
Yes.
I think I parked over near the Dragon Walk, kind of in that corner there.
All right. And if you could pull up Exhibit 267 again. Does that building appear to be the Dragon Walk?
Yes.
And obviously, since we have this photo, your body-worn camera was activated. Is that right?
Yes.
Do you recall at what point you activated your body-worn camera?
Probably about 2 blocks out.
At the time, were you thinking that you were going to need to do a force review?
Yes.
Based on the description that the defendant gave you, you've already indicated you didn't know there was pressure applied to the neck. Is that right?
Right.
Did you get any sense from the defendant how long this restraint lasted?
No, I didn't have any idea.
When you arrived at scene, based on your rank and being a supervisor, did you become the senior officer in charge of the scene?
Yes.
Did you see the officers that you previously mentioned, the defendant, Thomas Lane, Tutau, and Alexander King present?
I did.
Did you have some conversation with those officers about the incident?
Yes.
Were the 4 of the officers in a group at the time you had this conversation?
Yes.
The people who were talking were Thomas Lane and Alexander King, is that right?
Yes.
The defendant was nearby and in a position to hear?
Yes.
And at that time, you received a summary of what happened from Officer Lane and Officer King, is that right?
Yes.
Both of them gave you a statement kind of joining each other?
Right.
You know, without talking about what specifically that statement was, after you heard their rendition of the events, did you take that information and use it to determine the next steps that you would take?
Yes, I did.
And based on that conversation, then, were you told that there had been a restraint of an individual?
Yes, I believe that they said they'd handcuffed him.
Okay. And did you learn that an ambulance had been summoned?
I did.
And did you learn that the person that had been restrained was taken away in the ambulance?
Yes.
And where was that person to have been taken?
Hennepin County Medical Center.
Based on that conversation, what did you decide to do?
I decided to drive down to Hennepin County Medical Center myself to check on the party's condition.
Before going to the Hennepin County Medical Center, did you give any direction to the officers that you'd spoken with?
I did. I believe I asked them to hang on to the suspect's vehicle and gather any witnesses that may be around.
And who did you direct to do that?
I believe Officer Lane and King.
Did you give any direction to Officer Tao or the defendant?
I did. I asked them to head down to Hennepin County Medical Center also.
And then you proceeded to leave the scene to go to the Hennepin County Medical Center.
Yes.
Before you actually left the scene, did you have a further conversation or direction to the defendant?
I don't think so.
Do you recall speaking with the defendant about the need to potentially interview witnesses?
No, yes, I did. I asked him to look for some witnesses.
And that was captured on the body-worn camera, is that right?
It should have been, yes.
You've had an opportunity to review that footage?
Yes.
Okay. At this time, I'm going to ask to publish Exhibit 266, and I'm also going to ask to publish 265. They're two different renditions of the same conversation. In Exhibit 266, you will see sort of the body position of the defendant as you're having this conversation, and in the next exhibit, you'll hear the audio. Yes, Your Honor. And Your Honor, I'll offer Exhibits 265 and 266.
Those are received.
At this time, asked to publish 266. Did you recognize your own voice in that clip, or was that kind of hard to hear?
It was hard to hear, but it sounded like me.
Okay. And you saw that Officer Chauvin, the defendant, was sort of leaned up against your squad car, is that right?
Yes.
And then if this, we can publish 265.
We can try. They're pretty, well, they're all pretty hostile.
Okay. Whatever you can get.
Okay.
And you can take that down. So you heard yourself directing the defendant to find witnesses and find their names, is that right?
Yes.
And the defendant told you that he could try, but that they were pretty hostile?
Yes.
But you asked him to do it anyway?
Yes.
And then when you drove away, where did you go?
Hennepin County Medical Center.
Do you know approximately how long it took you to arrive?
I'd guess under 10 minutes.
What did you do once you reached the Hennepin County Medical Center?
I went into the stabilization room,
What's the stabilization room?
a room where they take patients who are critical and work on them there.
What did you see when you arrived at the stabilization room?
They were working on George Floyd. I think they had the Lucas machine going, which does automated chest compressions.
Who was working on them?
Hennepin County Medical Center staff, doctors, nurses.
How long do you think you watched the staff work on Mr. Floyd?
A few minutes maybe.
Did you see or speak with any of the staff members who were working on Mr. Floyd?
I spoke with the nurse while I was there.
Did you ask the nurse for any information?
I was trying to get a condition update.
And did you?
I did.
What did the nurse tell you?
That he was doing bad or poorly.
Now, are you aware of whether, per your direction, the defendant and Officer Tao eventually arrived at the Hennepin County Medical Center?
Yes.
Did you see him in the stabilization room or near the stabilization room?
I think outside the stabilization room.
Exhibit 77 is a body-worn camera photo of the defendant. At this time, the state offers Exhibit 77.
77 is received.
And publish Exhibit 77. Right. And you see the defendant present here, is that right?
Yes.
And also noting the time on the body-worn camera, 21:05 and 7 seconds, is that right?
Yes.
So about 9:05.
Right.
And you also see Officer Tutau.
Yes.
After the nurse told you that Mr. Floyd was doing poorly, what did you do?
I believe I maybe had a conversation with Lieutenant Matson, who was car 9 that night.
What is Lieutenant Matson's role?
As car 9, he's kind of in charge of the city in the evening.
And what was the nature of your conversation with the lieutenant?
I think I just let him know that Floyd was doing poorly, and I think he was on the phone with Internal Affairs at that time, giving an update on what was going on.
Did in Exhibit 78 is another image from the body-worn camera depicting Lieutenant Matson. Offer Exhibit 78.
78 is received.
Publish Exhibit 78. Right. And what do you see in this photo?
Myself, some of the hospital staff.
And it was after you'd made these observations that you spoke with Lieutenant Matson?
Yes.
Okay. Did you attempt then, after your conversation with Lieutenant Matson, to gather more information from the defendant and Officer Tao?
I did. I think he requested me to ask them if they'd used any other force.
And did you have that conversation with the defendant? You can take that down.
I did.
Do you recall what the defendant told you?
I believe he said he knelt on Floyd or knelt on his neck, something of that nature. I don't recall his exact words.
And is that the first time you became aware that force had been applied to Mr. Floyd's neck?
Yes.
Did the defendant tell you how long he had applied pressure to or restrained Mr. Floyd and applied pressure to his neck?
No.
At some point, did you receive yet another update on Mr. Floyd's medical condition?
I did. Someone approached me and let me know that he'd passed away.
And after you learned that Mr. Floyd passed away, did that change the nature of the incident you were responding to?
Yes, it was deemed a critical incident then.
What is a critical incident?
Something like that where somebody passes away in police custody, a high level, call like a shooting, or where somebody shot and killed by police, things of that nature.
And what are your responsibilities then as the shift sergeant when a critical incident happens in an area over which you have supervisory authority?
It needs to be roped off with police tape and evidence preserved. Body-worn cameras, make sure they're turned back on.
Okay. What has to be done with the people who were involved in the critical incident?
They need to be kept separate and eventually transported down to the courthouse.
And in this case, did you take specific steps that were consistent with a critical incident response?
I did.
What did you do?
I got a hold of Sergeant John Edwards, who was the overnight supervisor who had just come on, and asked him to head down to 38th in Chicago and secure that scene. And then I believe I got a hold of some other sergeants to help set up rides for the involved officers down to City Hall.
Okay. So in he's contacting Sergeant Edwards, you're essentially handing off the actual physical scene to the next supervisory sergeant for the 3rd Precinct. Is that right?
Yes.
And you were able to secure transport officers or rides for officers Lane and King?
I don't recollect if it was me who found the rides for those two or Tom and Chauvin. But I found somebody to figure it out.
Can you describe your interactions with the defendant after you discovered that Mr. Floyd had passed away?
Other than asking him to get down to 108. Not too,
What's 108?
room 108 is one of the rooms in the city hall where the officers are going to gather to be interviewed and stuff after the critical incident.
What did you then proceed to room 108?
I did.
And what did you do after you proceeded to room 108?
I mostly just waited till the officers were interviewed and eventually headed back to the 3rd Precinct station.
Did you have any further interaction with the defendant at room 108, or did the other administrative personnel take charge?
Pretty much the other administrative personnel.
After then directing Edwards to secure the scene, making sure that the officers reported as they were supposed to, did you at some point gather some additional evidence associated with this case?
I did.
When was that?
I was back at the 3rd Precinct and I believe Officer Lane approached me and had forgotten some information in his pocket, some witness information that he'd taken from somebody in the vehicle, and turned that over to me, which I turned over to another officer to be property inventoried.
And after inventorying that information or that material, did you have any other involvement in the case?
I wrote a short report on turning that information over, and that was it for the night.
Okay. And when did your shift end that night?
I don't recall what time I left the station that night.
Now, again, you have reviewed the body-worn camera footage associated with this case, is that right?
I have.
And as the supervisory shift sergeant, you're a person who typically does force reviews, is that right?
Yes.
And to clarify your testimony from earlier, the restraint of an individual on the ground is a form of force, correct?
Yes.
And restraining someone on the ground handcuffed, that's considered to be the prone position, correct?
Correct.
Would you agree that a person may be restrained only to the degree necessary to keep them under control,
Yes.
and no more restraint?
Right.
Based upon your review of this incident, do you believe that the restraint should have ended at some point in the encounter?
Grounds?
Thank you, Your Honor. And sir, getting back to some of your duties as a shift sergeant in conducting force reviews, when you conduct a force review, you typically visit the scene, is that right?
Yes.
Interview witnesses, correct?
Yes.
Gather all the information, body-worn cameras, correct?
Yes.
And review that footage, correct?
Yes.
And make a preliminary determination as to whether or not it would be necessary to forward this for a review by internal affairs. Is that right?
Yes.
And if you review some body-worn camera footage and find there's nothing to review, you wouldn't forward that to internal affairs.
If I was doing a force report, I believe it would go down there anyway. All force reports do.
Would also go to internal affairs.
Correct.
If you review body-worn camera footage and determine that use of force might have been excessive, do you make a recommendation to internal affairs?
Yes. In that case, you'd have to contact internal affairs.
I submit the foundation, Your Honor.
Okay. Members of the jury, I'm going to have you take a break while we figure out a fairly sticky legal issue here. We'll have you back fairly soon. All right, we are outside the hearing of the jury. Be seated, please. Mr. Nelson has asked for an opportunity to voir dire the witness for a possible objection outside the hearing of the jury. Mr. Nelson.
Good afternoon, Sergeant Pleoger.
Good afternoon, sir.
So in the normal course of your duties as a police sergeant in reviewing the use of force, what you're describing is what you would normally do, correct?
Yes.
So if a use of force is reported to you by an officer, in those circumstances, this use of force review occurs by the shift supervisor, correct?
Yes.
And the shift supervisor would first and foremost report to the scene, correct?
Yes.
After that point, you would interview the officers that were involved, correct?
Yes.
You may interview the person upon whom force was used, right?
Yes.
You may interview witnesses to the use of force if they exist, correct?
Yes.
You may review body-worn cameras, other evidence, photographs, whatever else may be a part of that process, right?
Yes.
And it is much greater in, it's a limited, but it's a bigger scope, right?
Yes.
When a use of force incident becomes a critical incident, however, does your role change?
I would no longer do a use of force in a critical incident, nor would I do it if someone had suffered an injury, if they were handcuffed. That goes up the chain then to lieutenant in internal affairs.
Okay. So in certain circumstances, you would not be required to do that, right?
Correct.
And also, in addition, Your Honor, or Sergeant Pleoger, I apologize, you did not do any of that use of force review on May 25th of 2020, did you?
No.
You didn't speak with the officers in depth about what happened, correct?
No.
You didn't interview any of the witnesses that were at the scene, did you?
No.
And you didn't review the body-worn cameras that night, did you?
No.
In preparation for your testimony, were you given the entirety of the case file for this case?
No.
I mean, do you have 50,000 pages of police reports?
No.
Have you reviewed any of the interviews from any of the witnesses?
No.
Have you reviewed any of the statements that were given relevant to this case by any of the involved officers from those who did give statements?
No.
All right. So in this case, in preparation, were you allowed to watch the entirety of all of the body-worn cameras?
I think I did.
Okay. And that was in preparation or while you were being interviewed with the state prosecutors, right?
Correct.
Okay. So in terms of the information you have a a limited amount of information, which would be limited to just a review of the body-worn cameras.
Yes.
And that would not be the normal course for a sergeant's use of force review.
Yes.
I'm still not clear as to who made the decision in this case. So, Mr. Slisher, I don't have very much of a foundation for who gave this opinion or gave an opinion in this case. Could you follow up with?
I'm sorry, I had a hard time hearing.
I don't think I have a foundation yet. It sounds like on a critical incident, it gets passed up. Who made? I don't know who made the decision on use of force.
Well, there wasn't.
Could you maybe inquire, see where
I can, Your Honor. I want to just clean up one part of the record first. In terms of reviewing the body-worn camera footage with the state, I think the question was state prosecutors. you didn't review them with the state prosecutors, but you have reviewed those with prosecutors. Is that correct?
Correct.
Right. Other prosecutors, not associated with this particular case.
Right.
Is that right?
Yes.
Now, to answer the court's question, in terms of whether or not you did a use of force review pursuant to the policy, in this particular case, you did not, correct?
Correct.
Right? You passed the scene along and followed the critical incident policy, per the critical incident guidelines. Is that right?
Yes.
However, in the course of your duties as a shift sergeant, you do force reviews. Is that right?
Yes.
You follow the policy in conducting supervisory force reviews.
Yes.
Right? And if we could pull up the exhibit again, 222. You could go to the next page, please. Okay. In conducting a force review, if you could please call out Roman I. You contact the internal affairs unit commander by phone if the force used appears to be unreasonable or constitute possible misconduct. Is that right?
Yes.
So you make a threshold assessment of whether or not force is excessive or could constitute possible misconduct. True?
True.
And if you could go to the next page. And call out B. And again, based on the totality of information available at the time, if you as a supervisor feel that the use of force may have been unreasonable or not within policy, you can state so in your supervisory force review. Is that right?
Yes.
And that's the policy that you follow.
Yes.
And so, Your Honor, I don't believe that this is a lack of foundation. He has clearly qualified to give an opinion, and a limited opinion, that based on his preliminary review, as stated and disclosed, he believed that the restraint should have ended very shortly after Mr. Floyd was taken to the ground, handcuffed, and no longer resistant. And that's the sum and substance of the opinion I intend to offer.
If I could just follow a couple questions here.
In this particular case, the reason you called the lieutenant was because Mr. Floyd died, right?
I would have called the lieutenant first because force was used and he was in handcuffs. Any force that results or that's used when somebody's in handcuffs requires me to call the lieutenant and internal affairs.
Right. So that went up the chain naturally that way. And then when Mr. Floyd died, this use of force policy is replaced with the critical incident policy. Is
Yes.
that correct? So, Your Honor, I guess the issue here is this is exactly what the motions in limine were designed to effectuate. This officer, Sergeant Pleoger, did not make this determination. He has not done a use of force review as he would have done in this policy. He has not reviewed the entirety of the evidence in this particular case. And while he may have seen certain body camera footage and made some determination based on that limited information, he hasn't seen everything else. And so it is not within his purview, and this is what the motion in limine was specifically designed.
Okay. Mr. Slisher, as I understood it, you're asking a narrower opinion?
That's correct, Your Honor. I'm asking, exactly what I proffered, that in his opinion, the force should have ended very shortly after Mr. Floyd was on the ground, handcuffed in the prone position and no longer resistant.
You can ask that one question. Let's bring the jury back. Is this probably going to be our last witness? How long is that?
Another one in the hall. We could get him done in a half hour.
Okay. True. Okay. We'll see how it goes.
seated. All right, previous questions withdrawn. Mr. Slisher, would you ask your question?
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, based on your review of the body-worn camera footage, do you have an opinion as to when the restraint of Mr. Floyd should have ended in this encounter?
Yes.
What is it?
When Mr. Floyd was no longer offering up any resistance to the officers, they could have ended the restraint.
And that was after he was handcuffed and on the ground and no longer resistant?
Correct.
Thank you. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Mr. Nelson.
Good afternoon, Sergeant Pleoger.
Good afternoon, sir.
Thank you for being with us today. A few questions that I had to follow up on with you. When a police officer under your command uses force, are they required to immediately notify you?
It depends on the type of force.
Okay. Are there certain circumstances where you may get a phone call or a radio dispatch immediately?
Yes.
Are there certain circumstances or situations where you may get a phone call or a report of a use of force within 10 to 15 minutes?
Yes.
Are there circumstances where you may get a use of force report or from an officer from an hour or two later?
Not one that would cause me to have to go to the scene. That would be more immediate. They'd want to let me know right away because I need to get out there and interview the subject.
Right. But it could happen within more than, say, 10, 15, 20 minutes that you get that notification.
Yes.
It would be fair to say that in certain types of use of force, there may be other, or use of force cases, there may be other activities that the officer needs to do after the use of force. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
So they may use force against suspect number one, but then they have to apprehend suspect number two, for example, right?
Yes.
And they've used force on number one, but they get number two detained and it takes some time, then they call you, right?
Yes.
Or, for example, an officer may use force on someone, conduct some additional investigation, whether it be interviewing witnesses or gathering evidence, and then call you to report the use of force, right?
Yes.
Is there a policy within the Minneapolis Police Department that requires an officer who uses force to do that through dispatch channels?
No.
They could call you on your cell phone.
Yes.
They could send you a text.
Yes.
Basically, their requirement is that they need to reach out to you and say, hey, we need you to come to the scene, right? We
Yes.
use force. Now, just a second. Showing you Exhibit 221, Policy 5-306 regarding medical assistance. What do the first four words after medical assistance read?
As soon as reasonably.
Practical, right? Oh,
Yeah,
I
that's
said
five.
four. Ha, sorry, you got me. As soon as reasonably practical, right?
Correct.
An officer has to use or render medical assistance as soon as is reasonably practical, correct?
Yes.
Now, are you familiar generally with the Minneapolis Police Department's critical decision-making model?
Somewhat.
Essentially, when a police officer is engaged in a situation, would you agree that an officer is constantly taking in new information, processing that information, comparing it to what happened before, and making decisions based on information as it comes in.
Yes.
And information as an officer is dealing with the situation can change, right?
Yes.
And that information that they take in may, right?
Yes.
Or vice versa. They may have their gun drawn, realize that's too much force, put it away, and take out a different tool that they have, right?
Yes.
So officers are constantly assessing and reassessing a situation based upon the information as it comes to them. Agreed?
Yes.
You were an officer for what, 27 years, I think you said. You've, I'm assuming arrested hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals during your career.
Yes.
You've had to use force yourself.
Yes.
And would you agree with the general premise that the use of force is not necessarily attractive?
Yes.
Sometimes officers have to do very violent things. Agreed?
Yes.
It's a dangerous job.
Correct.
Have you ever heard the term hold for EMS? An officer says, I held him for EMS.
I'm not familiar with that.
Okay. So if you are involved in a use of force situation and an officer calls for medics, right? And I'm going to strike that. An officer decides to use the maximal restraint or the hobble, right? But a medical emergency arises and they call for EMS. Would it be consistent with the critical decision-making policy to say, I'm not going to hobble this person because I know EMS is on the way?
Objection, Your Honor. Sidebar.
Rephrase.
I'll rephrase, thank you. Assume an officer was engaged in a struggle with a suspect and decided to use the maximal restraint technique, but then the suspect had a medical emergency. Would it be common for the officer to decide, I'm not going to use the maximal restraint technique at this point. I'm going to hold this suspect in place until EMS gets here?
Objection calls for speculation.
Overruled.
So your scenario is an officer's planning to use the hobble and hasn't put it on yet, and then the suspect has a medical emergency, and then they decide not to use it, just hold them?
Right.
Yes.
When a maximal restraint technique is applied, the suspect is essentially handcuffed behind their back, and through a series of belts, their legs are bent at kind of an upward angle and then connected to some sort of device right around the waist.
I don't think they bend back towards the back anymore. They like to keep them straight.
Straight.
Right.
So, but there's a tie between the ankles and the waist, essentially.
Correct.
Right? And if EMS is on their way, the restraint, you've got to take that off and can delay medical care. Agreed?
You're saying I'm sorry, would you just repeat that?
If an officer uses the maximal restraint technique and EMS has to come, the officers have to remove that potentially, right?
Correct.
And that can delay medical treatment.
Sure.
Now, again, in your 27 years as a police officer, have you had to deal with crowds of people that form and watch your activity?
Yes.
In your experience as a police officer, especially in the more recent era, have you been in a situation where bystanders begin to film you and your activities?
Yes.
Does that happen more and more these days than it did 5 years ago?
Yes.
And have you been in a situation in your career as a law enforcement officer where the crowd starts to yell at you?
Yes.
or becomes a little more volatile.
Yes.
As an officer, does that cause you concern?
Yes.
Generally speaking, as again, an officer with 27 years of experience, if you're dealing with one potential suspect and then a new perceived threat emerges, but you know that person needs medical attention, do you deal with the medical attention and ignore the threat, or do you deal with the threat and then deal with the medical attention?
I guess you'd have to deal with both kind of simultaneously.
And that depends on the circumstances. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
So for example, if you were in a gun battle and someone was shooting at you and someone went into cardiac arrest, would you stop what you were doing to mitigate the threat, or in order to immediately perform CPR?
I'd
Or would you
mitigate,
continue with the threat?
I'd mitigate that threat to me.
You've gone through all of the standard training of the Minneapolis Police Department?
Yes.
You had to deal with suspects who've been rendered unconscious?
Occasionally.
You're aware that the Minneapolis Police Department, where the training indicates that you need to be careful because when someone comes back out of unconsciousness, they can become more volatile than they were before?
That can happen, yes.
You were asked a series of questions about about the sergeant's use of force review, right? A force review.
Yes.
And in a force review, there are certain things that you're required to do, correct?
Yes.
That would include having a conversation with the involved officer, right?
Right.
That would involve potentially having a conversation with the suspect upon whom force was used, agreed?
Yes.
Review of the body-worn cameras, right?
Yes.
Review of any other evidence that may exist, such as witness statements, photographs, phone records, whatever it may consist of, right?
Yes.
It's not a huge, very thorough investigation. It's kind of a cursory look, right?
Correct.
And, but there's more to it than simply watching a body-worn camera, right?
Yes.
In this particular case, when you arrived on scene, you initially spoke with Officers King and Lane, and Mr. Chauvin was present in that scene.
Right? Yes.
And he was listening as Officer King and Lane told you what had just happened.
Yes.
Now, when, in your experience as a police officer, when a supervisor's use of force, well, strike that. When one group of officers goes to a scene and a second shows up to assist, whose arrest is that? Is it the original officer or the assisting officers?
Should be the original officer.
And so when you're reviewing a circumstance, is it going to be, would it be your policy to talk to the arresting officers or the assisting officers first to find out what happened?
I guess I wouldn't care one way or the other. Whoever wants to tell me the story.
Okay. And if one officer is responsible for it, you're going to go to that officer, right?
Right.
And if two officers, you're going to ask them both.
Correct.
And if all of the officers are standing around and they're talking about it, that's what you need to do initially, right?
Correct.
Now, you were discussing again in this particular incident, when you arrived on scene, you asked, you kind of gave some direction to these officers, right?
Yes.
And at the point that you arrived on scene, you knew it was a use of force incident, but it was not what you call a critical incident. Agreed?
Agreed.
Because at that point, Mr. Floyd, to the best of your knowledge, was still alive.
Right.
If you know what the answer to that is.
One more time, sir.
At the point that you were initially on scene, you had no information that Mr. Floyd was deceased, right?
Correct.
Now, you then instructed the officers to do a few things, right? Potentially talk to witnesses, and then 2 officers to go down to the hospital with you.
Yes.
In their squad car.
Yes.
All right. And we saw this video where you instructed Officer Chauvin to try to get some witness statements, things of that nature, right?
Yes.
And he made the comment that he would try, but the crowd seemed pretty hostile.
Yes.
Officer Chauvin and Officer Tao ended up at the hospital with you,
They did.
and Officer King and Officer Lane remained on scene, right?
Yes.
At some point, when you learned that Mr. Floyd had died, the use of force review was no longer reviewed by you, correct?
Correct.
Someone died, well, and I believe even per policy, if someone was a use of force occurred while someone was in handcuffs, that policy required you to reach out to your superiors, right?
That's correct.
And if Mr. Floyd had not died, you would have not conducted a use of force review, correct?
Correct.
You would have left it to the higher ups, the people up the chain of command.
Right, since he sustained an injury in handcuffs.
Right. And likewise, when a suspect dies in police custody, you don't do a use of force review.
Right.
And you did not do a use of force review in this case, did you?
No.
Now, you talked about when it became a critical incident, the officers ended up at room 100 down at City Hall. I think you initially said it was the courthouse, but you're talking about City Hall across the street.
Yes, I said it wrong.
And that's a room that's maintained by the Minneapolis Police Administration, right?
Right.
That's where any involved officers go during a critical incident.
Right.
For officers who are involved or potentially witnesses to a critical incident.
Correct.
And you understand that the 4 involved officers were each individually transported to room 100, right?
I believe that was the case.
And you referenced that at that point, kind of the critical incident policy takes over and certain things have to happen pursuant to the critical incident policy, right?
Yes.
A whole host of things have to happen, right?
Yes.
You referenced interviews of officers. You have no idea if interviews of officers occurred in room 100 on or about May 25th, 2020 or May 26th of 2020.
I'm not positive, no.
Right. That's one thing that could potentially happen, right?
Yes.
But not necessarily.
Right.
Now, you testified that kind of at the end of the night, Officer Lane, or while the end of your involvement, Officer Lane handed you a couple of pieces of evidence that pertained to the arrest back at 38th in Chicago, right?
Correct.
Or the incident at 38th in Chicago, right?
Yes.
Do you recall what those items were?
I recall one for sure was a slip of paper with a name from one of the parties in the vehicle that he'd gotten.
Okay. Do you recall the other being an identification card?
I think so.
And do you remember the name of the person that was on the slip of paper?
I don't.
Would it refresh your recollection to review your report that you drafted that night?
Yes.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor? Counsel, it's Bates 117. I'll just read that in your head. Does that refresh your recollection?
Yes.
What was the name on the piece of paper? Shawanda Hill?
Shawanda Hill.
And the other item that he handed you was an Minnesota identification card, correct?
Correct.
With the name of William Smythe?
Yes.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
You're in, please.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, you were asked whether you agree with the proposition that sometimes police officers have to do violent things, and you agree with that, correct?
Yes.
But sometimes police officers should not do violent things, isn't that right?
Yes.
You were asked about the critical thinking model that's used and adopted by the Minneapolis Police Department, correct?
Correct.
And that's a model that requires officers to continually take in information, evaluate it, reevaluate it, reassess, and if necessary, adjust their conduct, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And as you stated under questioning by defense counsel, sometimes the information they're taking in would cause the officer to need to take more drastic measures, fair?
Yes.
But sometimes the information that the officer would take in would cause them to need to reevaluate what they're doing and use less drastic measures, correct?
Yes.
Some of the information that might be relevant is whether or not the subject is resisting, correct?
Could you say that one more?
One of the pieces of the information the officer may need to take in and evaluate is whether the subject is resisting, correct?
Yes.
And if the subject is not resisting, there is no longer a need to continue to restrain them, correct?
Yes.
And other information that might be helpful in making an assessment is to determine whether or not the subject is continuing to breathe, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, it is getting too deep.
At this point, Mr. Slisher, if you could rephrase.
Would it be important for an
Response is stricken.
Would it be reasonable then in the critical thinking model for an officer to determine and take in information about the subject's medical condition?
Yes.
For example, if the subject is no longer breathing, would it be important for the officer to take that into account to reassess and reevaluate what they're doing?
Yes.
Or if the subject no longer has a pulse, for example, would that be important information in the critical thinking model for the officer to take in, consider, and decide to maybe take a different step?
Yes.
And in such a case, would it be possible then that the officer would not need to do something violent, but would need to do something less violent,
Yes.
like render medical assistance?
Yes.
You were asked about a threat assessment, is that right?
Yes.
And you were asked about an example of whether an officer would perceive a threat if there was a gun battle and need to make a determination between medical attention and that kind of extreme threat, right?
Yes.
You reviewed the body-worn cameras, correct?
I've reviewed body-worn camera footage.
You didn't see a gun battle?
No.
Nothing further.
So the critical decision-making model requires the officers to take in multiple pieces of information and decide how to act based on the circumstances, right?
Yes.
Other factors they may consider is the size of a crowd, right?
Yes.
Their tactical position,
Yes.
traffic,
Sure.
rendering medical aid to a person in the middle of a busy street while buses and cars are turning. That may not be the best decision for an officer to make.
Right.
Rendering medical aid or while trying to deal with other people who are upset with you or volatile towards you may come into to play. Agreed?
Yes.
An officer who is essentially in a tactical disadvantage, that will come into play.
Yes.
Officers have to look at lots of different bits of information and decide how to proceed based on the totality of the circumstances and not just one single fact. Agreed?
Yes.
No further questions.
Nothing further? Briefly?
And an officer needs to consider whether other sources of information might be relevant to the need to render medical aid, correct?
Yes.
Including people telling the officer that a person was in need of medical assistance. That might be important for them to consider.
Sure.
And if somebody's communicating this in a desperate fashion, that doesn't necessarily constitute a threat to the officer, does it?
Sustained.
I have nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you. Thank you, Sergeant. You may step down.
Thank you, sir.
All right, members of the jury, we're going to adjourn for the day. We'll try and start up again around 9:15 tomorrow. We'll see you then.